Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I want to thank you everyone for indulging me while I made sure that we were all sitting in socially distanced seating. I want to make sure that we keep everyone safe. So, my name is Chris Richard, and I am the principal here at Hampton Bays High School. And each and every year, our PTSA sponsors a financial aid planning night. And Renee Nunziato from Suffolk Community College is our resident expert. She's been working with us for a couple of years. She has helped us with this presentation, but also with a Fafsa completion night in the past, which we're hoping to bring back to help families complete all the requisite paperwork to secure funding for college. So before I do that, I just want to make a couple of quick introductions to some of our counselors who are here tonight. So Miss Nicole Dalton, who's right in the back over there, guys, one of our counselors who's helping all our seniors with their college applications. And our 9th grade transition counselor, Miss Ariel Sori, is here this evening as well. So these are friendly faces that your kids see on a regular basis that are here to help you with the college and career selection process. And again, they're here this evening to help out as well. And walking in right now is Mr. Little. Mr. Little is Ms. Dalton's partner in working with the senior class to get everyone ready for that college application season. So that's your counseling team. They're doing an amazing job with your seniors this year. Juniors are going to get some serious time with the counselors in a couple of months working on college and career plans, so we can expect some great things there. So I know no one came here tonight to listen to me talk, so I'm going to turn the microphone over to Renee so that she can give us all an overview of what we need to do to figure out how we're going to pay for college. All right, have a great night.
Thank you very much. I am very excited to be here, and I'm excited to be here in person. It's so nice to be back in front of parents, and even I'm so happy to see that we've got some students in the auditorium tonight, because I think it's fantastic when the students are involved in the financial aid process and can understand what's going on, and that it doesn't rely all the time 100% on the parents. So welcome all, and we're going to get right to it. So how many of you in the room, this is the first time you're going through the financial aid process? By a raise of hands. Okay. So for those of you where this is the very first time, I bet you're feeling a lot of these things that you're seeing on the screen tonight. You're feeling confused, unsure, maybe a little lost. You're not really sure how this is going to work out. But I'm hoping by the end of the presentation that you're feeling better about things, less anxiety and apprehension over the process, because I can promise you it's really not as complicated or overwhelming as it seems. And we're going to go through everything step by step. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we're going to cover tonight, we are going to talk about the application process. We're going to talk about the federal application process, New York State applications, and then some other things that you're going to need to know about the financial aid process in general. We're going to talk a little bit about how financial need is determined, because as you do these applications, it's always a big mystery to parents and families how the school comes up with what's included in the financial aid package, and even how the FAFSA determines what kind of financial aid awards are going to be received. I'm certainly not training any of you to be financial aid advisors, but I'm trying to make the process a little more transparent so that you have a little bit of an understanding. We're going to go through all the different financial aid programs that are available that you may or may not see in financial aid packages that are offered to you by the different colleges and universities that you're looking at. And then lastly, we'll wrap it up with a Q&A. Okay? Okay, so when we talk about financial aid, it breaks up into really two categories of financial aid funds. There's what we call free money, which is going to be our scholarships and grants. The primary difference between them is that scholarships are going to be typically based on merit. So that might be academic merit. It may be based on a talent, musical talent, athletic ability, so on and so forth. And then you have grants, and grants are going to be typically based on financial need. The other category is self-help, and these are where our student loans fall into play, parent loans, and then work opportunities through the federal work-study program. There's a variety of sources of financial aid that is available to students and families. The federal government has several grant and loan programs available. New York State has a variety of grant and scholarship opportunities. Colleges and universities themselves are often giving out a significant amount of money to their students each and every year. And then there's a number of outside external sources. So these could be scholarships from, it could be things like from a parent's employer if they're part of a union. It could be regionally, local, even nationally based scholarships. There's a lot of different money out there, and we're going to touch upon this throughout the presentation. So as far as how is eligibility determined? So basically, financial aid is awarded based on financial need, merit, or a combination of both. But the bottom line is wherever the money is coming from, that agency is determining, or that agency or school is determining how those awards are being given out. So in other words, he who gives out the money makes the rules. So filing the Fafsa is going to determine how much a family can contribute in theory. New York State is a little simpler. It's going to be based on an income threshold and the student's enrollment status. And then when it comes to institutional aid, they could be offering need-based aid, merit-based aid, or both. Again, I mentioned previously athletic. It could be money available based on the academic program that a student decides to pursue, etc. So there is a philosophy of need-based financial aid, and it is that paying for college is a partnership between the family, the student, and the awarding agencies. That first and foremost is the responsibility of the student and the family, and that financial aid is there to supplement family resources. So let's talk about how to apply. It's important to understand there are different deadline dates, okay? In the admission side of the house, they're going to have certain deadlines in which admissions applications need to be submitted by, and then there are financial aid deadlines. Now, when we talk about financial aid deadlines, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, okay? Because the Fafsa, which is the starting point of applying for financial aid, technically the deadline to complete the Fafsa will be June of 2023. And you're probably scratching your head and saying, well, that's kind of weird, right? Because really what it is it ends up wrapping up the financial aid year, but you're going to get these applications done well in advance so that you have money available to you to make admissions decisions and know what the schools are going to be giving you. You're also going to have everything set up in a timely fashion so that you have money available to meet cost of education before the semester starts and when those bills start to come due in the summer. All right, we're going to get into a little more detail about that. Now, each school may require different forms, and this is where it becomes important to look at the financial aid web pages to each and every school you are considering, okay? So the Fafsa, like I mentioned, is the free application for federal student aid, and this is the starting point for financial aid applications. Now, there are some colleges and universities that will use an additional application called the CSS profile. More often than not, it's going to be private institutions that are going to require the CSS profile. And the reason I encourage you to take a look at the financial aid web pages before completing the CSS profile is, unlike the Fafsa, there is a cost involved with it. So you want to know if you really even need to fill it out or have results sent to a school so that you're not wasting any money applying for money, right? We have state aid applications. The New York State Tuition Assistance Program is a huge program. The New York State Excelsior Scholarship, they have the Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics Scholarship, etc. We're going to get into more detail about state aid, but that's an additional application that will be completed. And the other thing you want to take a look at those financial aid web pages is to see, is there any additional institutional forms that may need to be filled out in order to maximize the amount of financial aid a student is going to receive. Okay. So you're definitely not behind the eight ball, I promise. The Fafsa only opened up on October 1st, okay? But you'll want to mark a calendar for each October 1st because that is when the Fafsa will become available for the next academic year. And at this point in the year, we have two cycles running. We have the 21-22 Fafsa is available for the students that are attending college this fall of 21 and will be enrolled in the spring of 2022. For the seniors in the room, you will be completing the 2022-2023 Fafsa because that is going to cover the fall of 22 and the spring of 23, all right? You're going to be using your 2020 income information on that 22-23 Fafsa, All right, so if you filed taxes, it'll be the tax return. If you're not a tax filer, you'll be answering income questions about potentially income received in the year 2020. Now, when you go to complete the FAFSA, if you are a tax filer, you will be presented with the option to import the tax information using the IRS data retrieval tool. Now, as a financial aid professional, I am strongly encouraging you to utilize that tool if it is presented and available to use, because it reduces the errors made on the application, because it's pulling that necessary income information right into the application, and that way it's going to reduce errors. And so we really encourage you to use it when you can. Now, understand that any data that's pulled in from your taxes through the IRS data retrieval tool is going to be masked for your security. Okay, so once you pull that information in, you're not going to be able to view it. Your student won't be able to view it on the student aid report. But it cannot be changed, but really, there's not many circumstances that you would be changing that information anyway. Another thing I want to note about the FSA is that you can list up to 10 schools on the application. So you don't have to wait to find out whether or not you were accepted or your student was accepted. You want to just list any schools that are under consideration at this point. Now, if you are considering more than 10 institutions, the way you work around this is you're going to file the FAFSA with the first 10 schools listed. Then you're going to confirm that the school received the FAFSA information. And then if you have additional schools that you need to add to it, maybe schools number 11, 12, 13, and so on, you're going to have to pull a couple of schools off the application and add the new school codes. All right, but what happens is when you file the FAFSA application, the results of that FAFSA are going to be sent to each and every school that you list on the FAFSA. All right. So as far as starting the application, it is an online application. Now, there is a PDF version available, but I would dissuade you from using that only because anytime a paper FAFSA is filed, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to process, okay? Not only that, if you have to make a correction to the FAFSA for any reason, it's going to take another 6 to 8 weeks to process. When you file a FAFSA application electronically online, it processes within 2 to 3 days, and corrections have the same time frame. Okay, so really, you want to complete it online if you can. Now, if you're going to use a desktop or laptop computer, you're just going to navigate right to the website www.studentaid.gov. Okay. If you are going to use a mobile phone or a tablet, like an iPad or something like that, I would encourage you to download the app My Student Aid, okay? Now, both of these, whether you do it on a website or you do it through the app, it's the same FAFSA application, but the app itself is optimized for a mobile device. So it makes completing the application a lot easier because it presents each question one at a time, and it's just a lot easier to get through it than trying to look at a web page on a small phone, okay? Prior to starting the FAFSA or as you're doing the FAFSA, the student and the parent will need to create an Fsa Id and password. Now, there's some handouts up here that I would encourage you to pick up. We have a version in English and a version in Spanish available to you. But what it does is it walks you through creating the Fsa Id and password. These IDs and passwords serve as the electronic signature on the application. And for the student, more often than not, anytime they need to access any kind of federal financial aid website, if they have to complete additional steps, if they're taking a student loan, that Fsa Id and password is going to be used multiple times throughout the college career. I've got a couple of important notes that I want to bring up about the Fsa Id and password. Now, the FAFSA itself is the student's application. It is one FAFSA that is completed for the student, and the student will be in 99% of the cases, including parent information on the application. When you go to set up the Fsa Id and password, your student should be setting up their own with their mobile number and their email address, and the parent should be setting up theirs with their mobile number and their email address. The reason why, if you don't include your student in any other step in the process, please let them at least set up their own Fsa Id and password. Because each year you're going to need to use this. Now, if you forget it, or your student forgets their ID and password, The ability to retrieve it is done through a confirmed mobile number or email account. There's also a series of challenge questions that will be asked and answered. Now, if the parent sits down and sets up an FSA ID for Johnny and answers that, you know, their favorite food is pizza when really it's tacos or whatever it is, the likelihood of answering those challenge questions correctly is not going to be very high, so let the students set up their own, and then as a parent, you will set up your own. So again, just pick up one of these handouts because it is a nice tool and it's a good reference guide as you start setting up these IDs and passwords. So now as far as who has to provide information on the application, again, I mentioned the student is the applicant. Anytime on the Fafsa it is saying you or your, they're talking to the student. When they want to know about parent information, it's going to say parent 1, parent 2. So just to clarify. Now, a student is going to be considered dependent and must provide parent information on the Fafsa unless they meet very specific criteria. A student has to be a veteran or on active duty. They have to be married or have children or dependents that they provide more than 50% support. If they were an orphan, ward of the court, in foster care or legal guardianship, they would be considered independent. If the date of birth is prior to January 1, 1999, or they are designated as homeless or at risk of being homeless by a high school or other government agency, it will allow a student to bypass the parent information on the Fafsa. Now, there's lots of students in lots of different scenarios, so if a student does not fit any one of these federal criteria to be independent but does have extenuating circumstances, such as they're living with a different family member, for whatever reason. They may not have pursued through the court legal guardianship, but a student might be living with an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother or grandfather. They will indicate on the Fafsa no that they don't meet any of this criteria, but that they do have special circumstances. It will allow the student to submit the Fafsa without the parent information, but it doesn't process 100%. The student then needs to contact the school for further guidance. But again, in most cases, 17, 18-year-old students are going to be considered dependent for financial aid purposes because this whole application process in reality is a way for the government to distribute finite resources to millions of students across the country. So there has to be some mechanism to determine who is going to qualify for what. And this is how they do it through the Fafsa. Now on the state side of things, again, the dependency status is somewhat similar to the federal side. A student to be considered independent would need to be married, would have to be 35 or older. If they are 22 or older and they don't reside with the parents, they don't receive support, and they're not claimed on the tax return, they could be considered independent. If a student is under 22, meets that same criteria in bullet number 3, and they have a special condition like they are a ward of the court or the parental rights have been relinquished, they would also be considered an independent student. Now, if you feel like you're in a special circumstance and you need a little additional guidance, I am going to hang out after the presentation to have more one-on-one conversations with people if you need that extra help. So now, who is the parent on the application? This would seem very straightforward, but again, there's a lot of different families, a lot of different students, and a lot of different situations out there. So I just want to clarify. As far as who gets reported on FAFSA, it's going to be biological or adoptive parents. No other relative is considered the parent on the FAFSA application. If parents are divorced, if they are legally separated or they are physically separated, living in separate residences, the custodial parent, where the student lives, not who claims them on the taxes, is going to be the parent that's listed on the FAFSA application. If a custodial parent is remarried, the step-parent must be included on the application as well, regardless of whether or not that step-parent is going to provide any kind of assistance for college expenses. If biological parents are unmarried but live in the same house, they must both be reported on the application. Again, no one else is the parent. If you have questions or concerns, again, feel free to approach me afterwards and I can provide you with specific guidance. Okay, so the FAFSA application is going to ask a series of questions. It's pretty straightforward. On each question, there is a little button above with a question mark. It looks like it's a question mark inside of a circle. So if you're unclear about how to answer a question, you're going to want to click on that, and it's going to provide all sorts of additional notes and guidance as to what needs to be reported in what sections of the application. But essentially, it's going to start with some student information, then it's going to bounce to the parent, then it's going to bounce back to the student. Now, in some cases, there is certain information that will get skipped over depending on how the parent and student answer the questions. So if you're kind of comparing your experience filling out a Fafsa to someone else you may know, that experience could be a little bit different based on how they build in some skip logic. At the end of it, it is going to ask for both the student and the parent to sign, and you click on the button that says, you're signing it, you're entering the Fsa Id and password, and then you are submitting the application. And at the end of the application, you will receive a confirmation that it's been submitted. You'll get a confirmation number, and on that confirmation page is also a link to the New York State aid application. Okay, so if you are a New York resident attending schools or thinking about attending a school in New York State, then you'll want to complete the New York State aid application as well. So you'll click on the button, and while it looks like it takes you over to the Higher Education Services Corporation website, it's actually housed within the Fafsa itself when you link directly over on the confirmation page. So if you, by chance, close the browser before clicking over to the state aid application, that's okay. Your student will have to wait until they've received the email letting them know the TAP application or the New York payment application is ready to be completed. If you close the browser and you try right away to go do it, it's not going to let you because the Fafsa has to actually process, and there's an agreement between Fafsa and New York State where the Fafsa information actually goes to the state to pull in some of the information. All right, so again, it's either the link on the confirmation or the link in the email that the student will receive. Now, as far as who's qualifying for the New York State Tuition Assistance Program, any family with a net taxable income on the New York State return of $80,000 or less will qualify for a TAP award. Now, TAP award, the New York State TAP award is for students who are going to be enrolled full-time, so that's going to be 12 or more credits a semester. As far as how much a student can receive, the minimum TAP award currently is $500, and the maximum TAP award is $5,665. All right, so in the earlier slide when I said New York State is a little more straightforward, we're talking about an income threshold of $80,000, and then the awards are going to range based on how close a family is to that $80,000 net taxable income. Now, what's a little different with the New York State TAP application versus the Fafsa, where you can list a number of schools, TAP only allows one school code at a time. All right, so whatever the first New York school listed on the Fafsa is going to automatically pull in on the TAP application. If you want to change that, by all means you can. All it is it's a drop-down box that the student would indicate what school they would want the award information sent to. Now, it's important to make a note of which school you listed on the application, because if you're considering a number of New York State schools, ultimately, once an admission decision is made or once the student decides where they will be attending, you want to make sure that the TAP application, that school code is listed on the app. Otherwise, the school's never going to get the New York State aid information from Higher Education Services Corporation. One of the things they have integrated into the application process, and I've kind of heard mixed stories about this, is that the state may ask for the student to enter the school-issued student ID on the application. So if the student has received correspondence from the college, most of the time that correspondence is going to list a student's assigned ID number. So that's where that could get entered onto the application. At one point the state said they wouldn't let students submit it without one, but I understand that they are letting students now submit, and then ultimately they're communicating with colleges to get that that school assigned ID number. One thing I do point out, because I see a lot of TAP applications that are not fully processed because it's missing a dependent The dependent student is missing the parent's signature. This was added 2 years ago to the application. So a student who has to include parent information on the TAP application, at the end, the parent must sign it by typing in their name and also including the New York State issued ID number. So if the parent has a driver's license, learner's permit, or New York State issued ID card, that number will be entered at the end of the TAP application. So what are the next steps? Once the Fafsa and the TAP application are submitted, the student is going to be notified by each individual school about what their potential eligibility is going to look like. As far as the timing of when students are going to begin to be notified, it's going to vary from school to school. Okay, if you're filing the Fafsa nice and early now in October, which I highly encourage you to do because you want to meet any school financial aid priority deadlines, you may not hear until December or January about the financial aid piece. Okay, so if you file it tonight and you're looking at, I don't know, I'm just going to use Suffolk as an example. You're considering Suffolk County Community College, you go out, you file your Fafsa tonight. I can tell you that we don't start awarding our students financial aid generally until the beginning of February. Okay, we're a little bit later in the cycle. But that's not to say other schools may not be giving out their financial aid packages beginning in November. All right, so if you take a look at the individual financial aid web pages to the schools under consideration, a lot of the times they will kind of give a time frame as to when students can expect to start hearing about financial aid awards. Now, in some cases, the school may need additional documentation to finalize the financial aid eligibility. So in many cases, there is a student portal that the school will use for the student. And sometimes that communication is done through the student portal, other times it's done through email, sometimes it's a combination of both, and some schools are still using regular old United States Postal Service, although the number of schools using regular snail mail is getting smaller and smaller as time goes on because people are getting more adept and more used to and really kind of want electronic communication rather than snail mail. So in some way, the school is going to notify you about those financial aid awards, and that award notice may or may not include all available financial aid, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the financial aid programs. A couple of other tips that you should be aware of. If you do not use the IRS data retrieval tool to complete the Fafsa, it is a really good idea to have a copy of your 2020 federal tax return on hand. If you don't have a copy of the return, you should request a tax return transcript from the IRS, which can be done directly online. Any W-2 forms, including any the student may have received in 2020, you'll want to kind of have those readily available. If you did not file a 2020 return, you may be asked to obtain a non-filing letter from the IRS. So again, this is something you could be doing early on so that if the school requests the information from you, you do have that on hand and ready to be submitted if necessary. Again, you may not be asked for it, but you should have it ready to go in case you are. The other thing you want to be looking at is the school's web pages for individual scholarship information, because I mentioned earlier that a lot of schools are giving out a lot of money to students and families. Some schools offer scholarships to incoming freshmen based solely on the admission application, and there's nothing else the student needs to do. But in other cases, there could be additional scholarship opportunities that require a separate application. So this is where you'll kind of want to start compiling some of that information to see, are there additional things that could be applied for that would provide additional funds? You should be exploring community, regional, and national scholarship opportunities. Again, there's a lot of stuff out there. I'm sure the guidance office may have some information that could point you in the right direction. The web is a great resource for a lot of scholarship opportunities, but when you start to look at things like the national scholarship search engines or just plain old Google, you do need to use caution with the type of information that you are disclosing online. I'm sure many of you may have experienced this yourself, but if not, there's a lot of scams out there, and you got to just be careful. I've seen scholarship applications that have asked students to upload copies of passports. kind of a head scratcher, right? Why would a scholarship opportunity want a copy of your passport? Be careful with social security numbers, right? We don't want to be disclosing our social security numbers to some random website that's saying they have a scholarship opportunity available. But you do want to provide enough information about potentially academic majors you are pursuing, other interests, any kind of leadership abilities you may have, or things that you've contributed back to the community, so that these true, valid scholarship searches can match you up with the most amount of scholarship opportunities available, okay? And the other thing I want to mention is you should never have to pay money to be applying for scholarship dollars, okay? So if you're on a website that says if you pay us $100, we guarantee to get you at least $1,000, it is a scam. And click away, do not pursue something like that, because that's not going to be something that's valid. Okay, I want to talk about another important New York State program that it's been a few years now that this has been in existence. It's the New York State Excelsior Scholarship. And you may or may not have heard about this, but this is often that thing that's coined as the New York State free tuition. Students that are attending full-time at a SUNY or CUNY institution may qualify. The program covers up to full-time tuition or $5,500, whichever is less, minus any other grant or scholarship assistance received. The award does not cover tuition, fees, it does not cover fees, room, or board. All right, so it's a tuition-only award. So in other words, if a student qualifies for a TAP award, which is tuition-specific, right? It's the tuition assistance program, and they qualify for Excelsior, their Excelsior award would be reduced by whatever amount of TAP they are receiving, okay? As far as who qualifies for the Excelsior Scholarship, if the family has a federal adjusted gross income of $125,000 or less, you qualify for Excelsior. So that's a great opportunity for a lot of students. But it sounds too good to be true, right? Free tuition, there's got to be a catch, right? Well, sort of, but not really. Some things to know about the Excelsior Scholarship Program, right? Sound too good. There is a strict application deadline. So while you can be completing the Fafsa and the TAP application now, the Excelsior Scholarship application does not open up until the spring. So mark a calendar for April, and that's when you can begin reviewing the HES website for the application for the Excelsior Scholarship. There's also an opportunity to list an email address to be notified by HES when that application becomes available, and you can log on and complete it. Some things about the scholarship itself. It is a program that is designed for on-time completion. So that means a student receiving this award would complete an associate's degree within 2 years and a bachelor's degree within 4 years. A student needs to take at least 12 college-level credits per semester and complete 30 credits per year to maintain eligibility. That's how we get to the 2 years for an associate's and 4 years for a bachelor's. Because in general, an associate program is around 60 credits and a bachelor's program is going to be around 120 credits. But when you do the math, a full-time student is 12 credits or more, but if you do 12 credits and 12 credits, that only puts you at 24 credits, and if you try to do that again the next year, it puts you at 48. So you're not going to necessarily complete the program on time if you're only enrolling in 12 credits a semester. So this is where they get the minimum requirement of completing 30 per year. So now if a recipient transfers, they have to transfer the equivalent of 30 credits per year applicable to the new degree program in order to maintain eligibility. If a student, for whatever reason, has a gap in enrollment, or they decide to change their major and some of the coursework that they previously took doesn't count towards the new academic program, that could put them off track for completing within the required time frame, and they could potentially lose eligibility. If a student is decertified for not meeting the credit requirement or good academic standing component, then the scholarship could be lost forever, unfortunately. And the other piece to understand is that there is a 5-page contract that is signed by the student that includes a residency requirement equal to the length of receipt of the award. So if a student receives, let's just do even numbers, $5,000 per year for 4 years, that's $20,000. If the student does not live in New York State for 4 years post leaving school or post graduation, that $20,000 converts to a loan. But unlike a normal loan that accrues interest, any converted Excelsior scholarship does not accrue interest. So in a lot of ways, what this ends up being is a deferred tuition payment plan. So we get a lot of students that get very concerned about not meeting this residency requirement, and instead they're taking a federal student loan, or God forbid, putting it on a credit card. The Excelsior scholarship would be a better option in the end because there's no interest accruing if it ends up converting to a loan. And sometimes it's hard to say what's going to happen in 2 to 4 years from now, whether or not the student will still be in New York. So again, I can answer additional questions if you have those afterwards. Now, if a student is not attending a SUNY CUNY, there are a number of non-SUNY CUNY schools that are participating in a program that's very similar to the Excelsior Scholarship, but it's called the Enhanced Tuition Award. But not all other New York State schools are participating, okay? So a student can receive up to $6,000 annually through this Enhanced Tuition Award, and the student has to meet the same enrollment and residency requirements that an Excelsior Scholarship recipient would be getting. There are other grant and scholarship opportunities available through New York State. So again, if you are a student, New York resident, which I'm assuming all of you are, and you are going to be attending a school in New York State, you'll want to check out everything available through the state itself, because there are a number of opportunities beyond just the TAP program and Excelsior that I mentioned. So when you go to the HESC website, and again, it stands for Higher Education Services Corporation, they're the agency that administers all state awards. On their website is an option to click on paying for college, and then you kind of end up with this menu. That at the very bottom it will say a link to the complete list of opportunities, and that's where you can look at the other New York State scholarships and awards. There is again the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Award. There are awards for dependents of veterans. There are awards for military-connected students. There's a lot of opportunities there, so you should review what's available and see what other applications may need to be completed. But again, for the starting point for all New York State aid programs is the TAP Award. So even if, I mentioned that threshold of $80,000, even if the family's income is above that, you want to complete it if you're doing an Excelsior application or if you're applying for other New York State grants and scholarships, because it's really the starting point is the TAP application for all those New York programs. Okay. New York State, now the Fafsa, the federal financial aid, is available to students who are U.S. citizens, eligible non-citizens in a variety of categories, predominantly permanent residents, but there's a couple of other categories that could make a student eligible for the Fafsa. If you are a student that is not eligible to complete a Fafsa, because you may not meet the citizenship requirements, New York State, a few years ago, created or passed the Senator Jose Peralta New York State DREAM Act, and this allows students to access New York State funds, TAP, Excelsior, other New York State grants and scholarships without completing a Fafsa. Okay, so there is a spot on the HESC website where you can start an application. There are some handouts up at the front as well, and there are user guides. The user guide that you're seeing here on the screen is available up here, but this student is going to apply for any New York State aid funds through an application process that is conducted through the International Scholarship and Tuition Services. They're called ISTS. Next slide, please. Oh, maybe back one. There we go. So the student would complete the application. Once the application is submitted, the student is responsible to monitor the status of the application online. And then if a student is deemed eligible, they are emailed a notification once the decision is made. And the student does have to actually go in and accept any award being given through the DREAM Act. So I just want to make mention of that. If there's anyone that qualifies or you know of anyone that is looking for financial aid that may not be eligible for the FAFSA, help spread the word because it's giving a lot of students a lot of opportunities. Okay. So let's talk about determining financial aid awards. How does all of this stuff that's included on the application sort of turn to a financial aid package? Well, completing the FAFSA at the end of it comes up with a number called the expected family contribution. Now starting next year, all of this is changing. So even if you start to grasp how this stuff is awarded for the 22-23 year, it is going to be changing for 23-24. But really what the FAFSA does is it's measuring an ability to pay, not willingness to pay, and it's important to make that distinction. So what the schools do is we're taking that expected family contribution and we're combining it with another number called the cost of attendance. Now the cost of attendance is the annual cost at an individual college or university. And it's comprised of both indirect and direct costs. So direct costs are those billed by the school, and indirect expenses are things you're not going to be billed for, but they're still educationally related expenses. Now, oftentimes when you're looking at a school's website, this cost of attendance is like the sticker price, right? And so this can be very scary when you're looking at certain colleges and universities because that sticker price may be really, really high, but what I would encourage you, and you may have heard this or may not, is don't be dissuaded from applying to a school because of its sticker price, all right? The more expensive the school, the more heavily they discount tuition, usually, right? So these schools like, the schools like the Harvards, the Yales, the Sarah Lawrence in New York City that has one of the highest cost of attendance in the country, they give out a ton of money to needy families. Okay, so don't be dissuaded by a sticker price and say, well, there's no way I could ever afford it. You have to wait and see what the school gives you in terms of both your federal, state, and institutional financial aid funds. So again, tuition fees, room and board, if you're living on campus, would be direct expenses. If you're not, your room and board, you're still given an allowance for that, but you won't receive a bill for it. Always included in the cost of attendance is transportation, and then other miscellaneous personal expenses. So that is how the school comes up with the cost of attendance. So what the school and what the financial aid office is then doing is taking the cost of attendance and subtracting the result of the FAFSA, the expected family contribution, to determine the level of financial need. So now the expected family contribution is going to be the same no matter what school you apply to, because that is the result of your FAFSA application. Where things get different is the cost of attendance number. So at school ABC, a student with this result of a FAFSA would be demonstrating financial need of $17,000. At school XYZ, if their EFC is $15,000, they're not demonstrating financial need. But that doesn't mean you're not going to qualify for aid. It's just you may not be qualifying for need-based financial aid. And that's where we're going to get into the different programs. But this is sort of how each school is going to kind of determine a student's eligibility. This is where I'm going to shed a little light. I don't want to spend too much time on this piece of it, but this is sort of how all the information entered onto the FAFSA comes up with the expected family contribution, because usually there's a lot of shock at the end. Families say, well, how does the government even come up with this money, and how can they expect that this is what I can contribute next year when my son or daughter goes off to college for the first year? I want to shed a little light on this. Again, I'm not training you to be a financial aid advisor. It's just really kind of providing some transparency. So basically how this breaks down is that there are 4 primary components of the FAFSA. What's going to go into the expected family contribution. It's going to be the contribution from the parent's income, the parent's asset, and then if the student contribution from income if they worked, and any contribution from a student asset. So what the FAFSA does is it calculates discretionary income. So you're going to be, again, entering total income from 2020 based on the questions asked. It could be taxable, and then there's some forms of untaxed income that are reported on the FAFSA as well. But then there are certain adjustments made to the income that's reported, because the government doesn't say, well, based on all this income, then that's how they come up with it. There's other credits that are applied similar to how when taxes are filed. So there are tax allowances, there's employment expense allowance, there are state taxes that are credited against that number, and then there's something called the income protection allowance, and this is where I like to point this out because basically the government says for a family of 4 with 1 in college, the income protection allowance, which is earmarked to cover basic needs, is $30,190. Not a very high number when we think about reality, right? So that's where kind of some of that taxable and untaxed income is then reduced down through these different protections and allowances. Next is the parent asset. So now when completing the Fafsa application, this will not be the case for every single applicant, but if the parent is required to report asset information, there will be a question presented. And the question is going to say, do the parent's assets exceed, and it's going to display a dollar amount. The dollar amount it is presenting is the parent's asset protection allowance, which is based on the age of the oldest parent reported on the Fafsa application. So for, it's going to be different. It's a chart that basically for each age, it's a different dollar amount. So the parent needs to stop and say, well, what are these assets that I need to think about to determine whether or not my assets exceed the dollar amount presented on the application? So any cash, savings, or checking accounts, money in those forms are going to be considered an asset. If you are a business owner, or a parent is a business owner with the equivalent of 100 full-time employees, there is a net value of the business that ends up on the application. Any real estate other than the primary residence is considered an asset. Anything like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, 529 savings plans, trusts, and other investments would be considered an asset. Retirement plans are not an asset. So if you have a retirement account, a 401k, a 403b, an IRA, that is not considered. So when that number is presented, take any retirement funds right out of the picture to determine whether or not you need to answer the question. Again, I mentioned there is an asset protection allowance. So just to give you an idea, we've seen a decline in how much savings is protected from year to year. A couple of years ago, we were looking at numbers. If the parent was 40, we were at almost 17,000. You can see now it's basically pretty low. So what you're going to be seeing is essentially if you have more in the bank or in these assets of, I'm going to kind of shoot it out there, of like 5,000 or more, you're going to end up reporting some asset information on the application. I want to talk a little bit more about 529 savings plans because this is a common question. If the student, if a 529 account is owned by the student who is providing parent information on the application, it is considered a parent asset. I'll say it again. If a student has a 529 plan in their own name, they own it, it is reported under the parent information of the application. All accounts owned by parents for any member of the household is reported as an asset as well. So if you have a student who maybe has younger siblings or even older siblings for which they have 529 plans in either their name or the parent's name, all get reported as an asset. 529 plans owned by someone not reported on the Fafsa. So an example would be grandma or grandpa opened a 529 for the student, or an aunt or an uncle did. Those 529s are not reported as an investment because those people are not reported on the application. Okay. However, down the road, any disbursements or distributions from a 529 end up being reported as other income received by the student, really on a Fafsa 2 years later. Another type of account is custodial bank accounts. So you may, as a parent, be a custodian to a bank account for a minor. It's owned by the student and it is reported as a student asset. If you are the custodian on any other sibling accounts or any other minor accounts, you do not report that under the parent section of the application. Okay. So we went through the parent income, parent assets. Now the other two pieces of it were the student's contribution from income and assets. I like to display this because we have a lot of students that work part-time jobs. Some and people get very concerned that if a student is working, it's going to hurt them when it comes to financial aid. If the student is earning less than $7,000 or $7,040 or less, none of it even considers into the expected family contribution. So in other words, I'm showing this to you so that you don't have to be worried that if your student has a part-time job, it's not going to hurt them when it comes to determining financial aid eligibility. Now, unlike a parent who has an asset protection allowance, the student does not. So any money in the bank for the student, or cash, is going to be assessed at roughly 20%, okay? So the reality in the expected family contribution is that the federal government's definition of discretionary income, it's not necessarily going to coincide with yours. New York is a high cost of living area, particularly Long Island. Some people spend more money on discretionary items than the government considers necessary. So one of the things you will notice is that the Fafsa and like the TAP, they are all income-driven applications. They don't ask about what's a mortgage or what's your rent or what's a car payment or your car insurance. It's an income-based application, okay? You may have a zero contribution from your assets, but use assets for your family contribution. So in other words, a family may have an EFC of $10,000, but not actually have $10,000 to contribute. They may be able to take a loan on their retirement, for instance, or they may be able to take a home equity line of credit. So that's what I'm talking about when I say you may not have a contribution from the assets, but you can use those assets if you needed to. Right, now I want to get into the financial aid programs themselves. So this is where you're going to start sort of understanding some of the things that you're looking at in these financial aid award notices given to you by the different schools. So as far as the federal aid programs go, there is a federal Pell grant available to students whose expected family contribution ranges from $0 to $5,846. This is the current Pell eligibility for students enrolled in 21-22. It'll change again slightly. It always goes up just a little bit from year to year. But if a student has a higher EFC, they're going to qualify on the lower range of the Pell. And as the EFC goes lower and lower, you can see that the minimum award amount is $336, but the maximum award amount is $6,495. So this is where students and families that demonstrate high levels of financial need, you can start to see where a Pell grant of $64.95 and a TAP award or Excelsior award of over $6,000, I don't want to say Excelsior, TAP, that's providing over $11,000 just from those two programs right off the bat. There's another federal grant program available to students called the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, also known as SEOG. This is awarded to students and families that demonstrate high financial need, and they typically have to be eligible for a Pell grant. You'll notice at the very end of that bullet, it says it's a campus-based program. So when we talked about deadlines for financial aid very early on in this presentation, schools are going to establish a priority filing deadline, and to be considered for campus-based programs like the SEOG award or even the work study program, a student's going to have to meet that priority filing deadline. So again, start the homework now and start to see when do these applications need to be completed. The earlier the better, right? So you're here. It's good that you're getting a grasp on this now, but you don't want to wait too long to actually complete the Fafsa so that you're meeting all of those priority deadlines. The federal government offers a variety of loan programs, okay? So the student loans fall into two types, the subsidized and unsubsidized loan. The primary difference is that interest does not accrue on a subsidized loan while the student is in school or during their grace period. On an unsubsidized loan, a student is responsible for the interest over the life of the loan. Now, some of you will say, but how is a loan considered financial aid if I have to pay it back? Well, if a 17 or 18-year-old student were to walk into a bank and say, I need money to go to school, and they have no credit history, they have no job, that bank is inclined to say no, right? So the federal government allows students to access loans through the direct loan program with no co-signers and no credit checks involved. They simply need to file a Fafsa. So when I said early on that not all aid programs will be included in an award package, but they may be available to you, this is where a school may not offer a student loan to a family that demonstrates high financial need. They do this because the other grants and scholarship information or scholarship awards may be covering very close to the cost of attendance, and they want to deter students from overborrowing. So I can, at Suffolk County Community College, if you qualify for a maximum Pell grant, we don't automatically include a loan in your financial aid package, but you're always eligible to take one if you need to. You just contact the financial aid office or look at their website to say, how do I indicate to the school that I want to take a loan if it's not included in the aid package, okay? There's a parent loan available. It's called the Direct Parent Plus loan. This loan is a credit-based loan in the parent's name, however. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the loans. But another federal aid program that may be included in the award package is the Federal Work-Study Program. Now, if you see this, I typically recommend to students and families not to necessarily count the dollars in the work-study program as funds that are going to go towards paying tuition, fees, room and board at the school. It's usually better to kind of approach work study as helping to assist with some of the indirect expenses. Because like a regular job, the student has to show up and work and earn the funds through the program, and they're going to be doing that throughout the course of the entire academic year. But the bill is going to come due for the school in, say, August for fall semester and probably January or December for the spring semester. So the student will not have earned all of those funds yet. So this is where it's extra pocket money for personal expenses, maybe some transportation expenses, so on and so forth. So if you start to see work study awards in the package, I would encourage you not to necessarily count that towards reducing tuition and fees, at least right off the bat for when bills come due. A little more about the student loans. As far as how much students are able to access through the program, it is based on their grade level in school. So freshmen can have $5,500, and it goes up to $6,500 for sophomores, $7,500 for juniors and seniors. There is a maximum allowed under the subsidized type of the loan, and you can see that in the parentheses at the end. So a freshman can get $3,500, then $4,500, then $5,500 for the third and fourth year under the subsidized loan, but there's always this $3,000 add-on. Now, if a student, when we go back to that example about the cost of attendance on school XYZ where the student did not demonstrate any financial need, their loan offer or their loan option would be $5,500, but in an unsubsidized loan. Okay, it's not your job to figure out what kind of loan a student can have. That's our job in the financial aid office. So we always are going to offer the maximum that the student can have based on the demonstrated financial need. But I'm showing this to you so that you just have an idea of what kind of funds a student can access. So again, these loan programs, government guaranteed, no cosigners, no credit checks. The other thing is that the interest rate is really, really low on these loans, okay? Especially when you start comparing it to other financing options that exist. The current rate for the 21-22 loans is at a fixed 3.73%, and that's over the life of the loan. And this is just a slight uptick from the loans that were processed the year before, but every July 1st, that interest rate's going to change for the next academic year loans. There's a 6-month grace period that's given to the student before they enter repayment. If a student is borrowing an unsubsidized loan, it's highly encouraged to pay the interest while in school so that it's not added to the principal amount when the student enters repayment, okay? What I usually tell students is, so when it comes time, if you've taken any student loans during your career as an undergraduate student, you get your family or somebody to throw you a giant graduation party, and you invite every single person you know, because you know what they show up with? Cards. And you know what's in the cards? Money. And you can use that money to pay down any student loans or accrued interest you may have. The other thing is that these federal loans, they have really flexible repayment terms, and sometimes there's some options for forgiveness. So if you read the newspaper or you're kind of in tune with the news, you may have seen some things lately about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, because that's been receiving a lot of attention. That's one of a couple of different forgiveness programs available to students if they are borrowing federal loans. So again, that's why these loans are considered a financial aid option. If you're thinking that you might be taking, I say you, if the student thinks they're going to be taking a student loan while enrolled in school, there's a lot of loan repayment calculators available on the student aid website, and I would highly, highly encourage students to use these calculators because it's super important that they know what they're getting into. I always use the coined phrase, know before you owe, right? You don't want to get into a position, or you don't want your students to get into a position where they're borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and by the time they graduate, they've got a significant amount of debt, right? So it's just part of that decision-making process, and we talk about this so that you're able to make informed decisions. More about the loans, the parent loan. Parents can borrow this loan up to the full cost of attendance, less other financial aid, so it could be used to replace the expected family contribution if necessary. The interest rate on this is a bit higher. It's at a fixed 6.8%, and it does have an origination fee added onto it. So that's subtracted from the loan amount in terms of what the school's going to end up with. Again, it's based on the parent's creditworthiness, and it's not guaranteed for all students. So this is where you have to take a look at those financial aid offers to say if a bulk of it is a Parent Plus loan, well, that's maybe not the best option or the best financial aid package because it's all loan funds, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for the parent, they typically repay while the student is enrolled, but there is an option to defer it until after the student graduates. If the parent applies for the loan and is denied, they have the opportunity to apply again with an endorser, which is a cosigner, or the student can access additional unsubsidized funds, $4,000 for the first 2 years, $5,000 for the next 2 years. So when I worked at a school that had a bit of a higher expense per year, we would encourage students, if they needed more loan funds, but they couldn't get it through maybe a private loan, and the parent couldn't get it because the parent wasn't creditworthy, we would encourage the parent to still apply because it let the student have more in those student-based funds. Last type of loan option out there available to students and families is the private education loan. All right, so this is usually considered the last resort type of loan. It's going to be based on the creditworthiness of the student who is the applicant or the borrower. And again, usually just typically because based on age and a lack of a credit history or an established credit history, they are going to likely need a creditworthy cosigner. As far as what the interest rates and what the terms of the loan look like, it's all dependent on the particular lender. It's that you and your student choose. There are often fixed rate options, variable rate options. There's options to repay while the student is in school, to make interest-only payments, or to defer the whole thing until after graduation, all right? So that's why if a student is applying for one of these, they want to make sure that they understand the terms of the loan, because sometimes the interest rate on these loans can be quite high, okay? So like we're talking double digits, comparable to credit cards, so you want to use caution with that. A little bit about institutional financial aid. Again, he who gives out the money makes the rules. So you could be looking at different types of institutional aid depending on the college or university. Could be need-based, could be merit-based, could be skill-based, athletic talents, academic majors, things like that. If you are awarded a scholarship through the college or university, you want to make sure you know the terms of the award. There's a lot of types of scholarships out there called recruitment awards, and they're only good for the first year. It's to entice the student to come. So those are fine and well, but if it's only good for the first year, how are you going to fill the gap in years 2, 3, and 4? Something to consider. Renewable scholarships often have GPA requirements attached to them. So you want to make sure that whatever that GPA requirement is, that you feel strongly and your student feels confident that it's an attainable GPA from year to year. And the other thing is if it has any kind of program requirement. So again, like if a student's getting an athletic scholarship to play on a soccer team and they decide they don't want to play on the soccer team anymore, well, guess what happens to the scholarship? They don't get it anymore, right? Or if a student is in an academic program because the school is trying to attract more students into a program, if they decide to change their major, they may no longer be eligible for that particular scholarship. So that's just all things you want to consider when we talk about knowing the terms of the award. So as you sit down and you get these financial aid award notices and you print them out and you lay them all out on the kitchen table or the dining room table or wherever you put them out, you kind of need to take a look at a couple of things. First, you want to take a look at the total cost of the institution itself. And it's important to consider transportation expenses. I talked to a lot of different schools. We've got students that are considering schools all over the country. So unless if your student is considering a school in California and you live here on Long Island, unless you're dropping that student off or you're sending them to the airport for, to report for the first day of classes, and you say, well, I'll see you in 4 years when you graduate, there's going to be some transportation expenses, right? I'm sure they're going to come home for holidays or breaks, things like that. So it's something to take into consideration. Again, books and other miscellaneous expenses, they're all things that the student is going to incur a cost for, but will not necessarily be billed for it. When you look at those financial aid award offers, you want to take a look at what's making up that financial aid award package. How much of it is gift aid versus how much of it is self-help aid? And this is where sort of going back to these aid programs that we just talked about. Hopefully you now have a little bit of an understanding to identify the differences between the free money and the stuff that either needs to be paid back or the student has to work for. We talked about the terms and conditions of institutional aid. The other piece is if a student is awarded campus-based aid funds through the SEOG program or work study. Those are awarded on an annual basis. So if a student gets an SEOG grant for, say, $3,000 the first year, if that Fafsa is not filed on time by the priority deadline for the following year, they may not be considered for the award. Or the family income situation could change and the student may not qualify for the award. So you just want to be cognizant of that. And you want to compare the annual net cost. I bring this up because I used to work at Stony Brook University, and Stony Brook had a number of scholarships that they offered to students, and we would be fielding the phone calls as students were trying to make decisions about where they would be attending, and it never failed. The hundreds of calls that we would deal with included a call that went very similar to this. Hi there, so I see that my son got a scholarship at Stony Brook for $3,000. Syracuse University is giving me $20,000. Okay, so my response would then be, but what is the tuition, fees, room and board at Syracuse versus Stony Brook? Considerable differences, all right? And so when we talk about the net cost, that's what we're talking about. What is that bottom line out-of-pocket expense going to be for the student, for you as parents potentially, and for the student or the family as a whole? You want to take that into consideration. Utilize those federal loan calculators to understand what the loan repayment is going to look like after graduation, because again, more and more students are borrowing funds to attend colleges, and they may then be going on to graduate programs or even doctorate programs. Unfortunately, at the graduate level and at the doctorate level, the type of financial aid available that comes from the Fafsa is going to be all student loans. Okay, so incurring a ton of debt when a student plans on maybe pursuing a degree program that in the end could be a combination of 8 or more years, it's important to understand what that repayment may look like year after year. Other miscellaneous info, for the school that the student is attending, each year they're going to issue something called a 1098-T, and that is given, you want to keep an eye out or remind your student to make sure they get that to you, because that's a credit that gets claimed. It's an education credit that you as a parent can claim on the tax return and get some additional funds back potentially, or reduce your tax liability. So you'll want to talk to your accountant to see if you can qualify for that. I include the AmeriCorps program on here just because it's a national community service program that provides funding for education in exchange for that service, and the awards can be up to $5,500. They can be used to either pay current education expenses, future education expenses, or even repay federal student loans. So when we talk about researching other outside opportunities, the AmeriCorps program, if you're interested in something like that, could be an opportunity for you. Important Fafsa websites or important financial aid websites. So the Fafsa and federal student aid are all housed now in the same webpage, studentaid.gov. If you're going to take notes on anything tonight, it would be to write down that website, because that's where you're going to complete the Fafsa. That's where you can find more information about all the federal aid programs that I talked about. There's a ton of information out there. I highly encourage you to read some of it over so that you have a full understanding. The Higher Education Services Corporation, again, that website is hesc.ny.gov. I do have a phone number on there, but how the state has been operating for the last we're going on close to over a year and a half at this point, is that they are booking phone appointments. So if you have questions or you need assistance with completing a TAP or an Excelsior or any kind of payment application through the state, you have to book an appointment. So they have a process right on their homepage or under their Contact Us link to do that. Do we feel better? A little bit? Maybe not as confused or scared or, full of anxiety as you may have felt walking into this room? I hope so. I hope you're feeling a little better about that. You are welcome to email me any questions. Again, I'm going to hang out afterwards for one-on-one questions, but I'm happy to take some questions as well. My email address is nunziar@suny-suffolk.edu. Feel free to email me. You can just mention that you were here tonight at Hampton-based high school, and that you were at the presentation, and that you've just got some questions, and I will do my best to provide guidance in any way that I can. Don't take it personally if I don't respond same day, okay? But I do promise I will get back to you if you send me an email. So with that, are there any questions that anyone wants to ask right now as a group? Yes? Yes. It's all one application. So her question was that I had said previously that the student and the parent need to fill out the Fafsa. It's the same single application. It's not that the student does one and then the parent does one. When you're on the studentaid.gov website and you click the link to start the Fafsa, the option is either to log in as the student, and the student would log in with their Fsa ID or password, or it says I'm the parent, and you start the application by entering the student's name, social security number, date of birth. But it's all a single application that will bounce asking questions about the student and the parent. So this is where, again, your student is probably not interested in the financial aid process. Clearly there's a few because they're here tonight and I love it. But for the most part, students would rather be doing something different, attending football games, playing video games, they would be working, busy. This is a great opportunity for some bonding with your student, make some popcorn, get some soda, sit down, and spend 45 minutes filling out the Fafsa application together. Because this is where, because it's going to bounce back and forth, the student can answer the questions about their information, and then the parents can just, slide the computer over and answer questions about the parent section. But it's all one application, and it does need to be filed year after year. So every October 1st, mark your calendar, because right now you're going to do Fafsa for the freshman year. October of the student's freshman year, October 2022, see if I can get my years right, you will then be completing the 23-24 application that's going to cover the student's second year of college. And it just kind of bumps so on and so forth. All right, so you just want to remember that it is an application that needs to be done each year. So again, the Fafsa deadline, it's like very far away. It's June of 2023. But you're going to do the Fafsa now so that everything is set up in a timely fashion, that students are going to know what they're going to qualify for well in advance of making admissions or making a matriculation decision. Technically, the deadline is very far away, but it doesn't make sense because if you wait until spring of the freshman year, you will have had to lay out a bunch of money to pay tuition and fee bills when you could have had some financial aid set up. So there are priority filing deadlines, and again, just because you miss a priority filing deadline doesn't mean you can't do the Fafsa. You just may not be considered for as many financial aid programs. So this is where I say get a notepad or get a notebook and dedicate it to just the financial aid or the whole college process where you can jot some things down. But take a look at the financial aid page of every school under consideration to see, again, what applications are needed, what are the priority deadlines, and are there any other additional institutional forms that may need to be filled out. Other questions? Yep. It is, yes. Suffolk is a SUNY school, so is Nassau Community College. Oh yeah, yep. We all process, all of the colleges, there's very few schools out there in this country now that do not process federal student aid, very few. It's usually the proprietary, the for-profit institutions that may not be processing financial aid, but right away their website is going to tell you. But, general, public, private colleges and universities throughout the country are processing federal financial aid funds. So that's the Pell, the loans. But again, a New York State resident would need to attend a school in New York State to receive New York State financial aid awards. It's not a portable award. So it doesn't transfer if the school decides to go to school in New Jersey or Connecticut or anywhere else in the country. Yes. So his question is the IRS data retrieval tool on the Fafsa website. The answer is yes. It's actually part of the application itself. So when it starts to ask questions about the parent, it's going to say, it's going to ask, did you file a 2020 tax return? And, if the answer is yes, what kind of return? And if it's a United States 1040 form, based on the parent's marital status, it may or may not display the option. Parents that are married but file their taxes separately do not have the option to use the data retrieval tool. If the parent's marital status has changed after the 2020 tax filing year, it will not provide the opportunity to link to the IRS data retrieval tool. And then sometimes, just linking over sometimes can pose a challenge because while it's a very good system, it's not completely foolproof. I would encourage you to have a copy of your actual 1040 in front of you because one of the things as an identifier and for security reasons, it's asking for the exact address as typed on the tax return. So if you're an accountant, you live on 123 Cherry Street and the accountant spells street spelled out, and you're trying to put in ST period, the abbreviation, it's going to come up as a mismatch and it won't let you use it. So you want to type it exactly how you see it, but again, sometimes there's little hiccups and you can't always connect over, but if you can't, you would just have to manually type in the information, and this is where those little help buttons are really useful, because if you click it, it tells you exactly what line number to look at on the taxes to provide the information on the application. Yes? How do you find, I'm sorry, the CV?
The CV financial aid ID on CSS?
Like the school, is it where it's asking for the school code information?
See, it's actually, it's not spelled out financial aid, it's FIN aid.
FIN aid. That I'm not 100%, I don't have a lot of experience with the CSS profile, but I'm happy to take a look at it if you want, yeah. Because it might be the school code information it's looking for, but I can take a look at it with you after, yeah.
Are they asking about the CE code?
Yes.
Okay, I think accountants might be able to help you.
Thank you.
Other questions? No question is a dumb question.
So if you're applying for financial aid for a child before they accept in college?
Absolutely, yes. So that's where we talked about before that the deadlines and things or the time frames are not necessarily the same. Financial aid students are able to apply right now for the financial aid programs. And this is where sometimes there's like a little bit of a mismatch because I have my stepdaughter is a senior and every day it's like, okay, have you compiled the list? And she tells me, oh, she's so ahead of the game. I'm like, you literally don't even know where you're going. So I need you to do something because we got to at least get the financial aid application. So I said, just give me some schools that you're at least thinking that you're going to apply to. Because again, you can list up to 10 schools and it's free. Right, on the Fafsa. So if your student has absolutely no idea, but they've got at least some thought, just get the financial aid application done. If you file the Fafsa and it turns out that the student says, you know what, well, now I'm going to apply to all of these schools, but we didn't list them on the financial aid application, it's a very simple correction. The student logs back into their Fafsa and they just add the school codes, and then it produces a second transaction that's then sent out to those schools. So you could wait a little while, but I wouldn't wait too long, only because you want to be meeting any kind of priority filing deadlines that the school has established. And, the school is not going to, if the FAFSA opens up on October 1st, the schools are not out there establishing priority deadlines that it needs to be done by October 31st. Okay, so I don't want you to panic and think it has to be done tonight when you get home. You have time to get it done. You just want to meet those priority deadlines to be considered for maximum aid. Really? No other questions? I'm at the Selden campus. I'm the campus director of Aid at the Selden campus, the Ammerman campus, yeah. All right, well, I would like to thank you so much for your time. I hope you found the experience worthwhile. I am going to hang out up front if you need to ask individualized questions or discuss anything that you still have confusion about. Otherwise, you can send me an email, and I would like